All right, well, welcome to this session of Death Ambassadors, talking about death education and death awareness. My name is Dr. Susan Strigley, and I am a professor at Nipissing University in Northern Ontario, Canada. I know this is an international conference, so I'd like to locate us. And we are coming to you from the lands of the Anishinaabeg in the treaty lands of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And we're very grateful to be here, to be teaching here, to be working here, to be living here and studying here, and to be broadcasting to all of you. So it's my great pleasure to be part of Lifting the Lid. So I have been teaching courses on death at my university for the past 20 years. Since I came here, I was given a course on death and dying that I was asked to teach. And so over the years, I've developed these courses, and now I teach two primary courses in death education. One course is called Death and Immortality, where we look at the death positive movement. We look at different ways that cultures across the world think about death. We look at different methods of disposition of bodies. We also study two primary spiritual and cultural traditions that I think do death pretty spectacularly, and that is Mexico's Day of the Dead celebrations and Buddhist practices of meditation and preparation for death throughout life. And then the other course is focused more on end-of-life care, and it's really now become a social justice course where we look at barriers to good end-of-life care, whether that has to do with Indigenous peoples, people of color, LGBTQ folks, what is ageism in end-of-life care? How do we think about the environment when we think about our dying planet and our preparation for that? And so these two courses I teach in alternating years. And the reason that we are here today is to share some of those things from my students who have taken those courses with me, and to talk about why death education matters so much and why it matters to them in particular. I would say that teaching these death courses that I've been doing all these years has been one of the most revelatory experiences of my life, that I have come to see the power of death education, the absolute crucial aspect of bringing death education to our younger generations so that they can start to change the conversation. And so where does this term death ambassadors come from? Well, let me tell you, probably about 5 years ago, I started saying to my students at the end of the class who had become critically aware of death studies, who had been, expanding their horizons and their ways of thinking about death, and who were frankly, quite fearless to go into the world and start having conversations about something that we don't talk about in our society nearly enough. And so I said to them, you are all my death ambassadors, and you are going to go out in the world and you're going to change the conversation. And let me tell you, they are doing that. They are changing the conversation. And so as of I think it was about a year ago, I decided to design some pins that say Death Ambassador. And now every student who takes my course, there they go, they're showing you their pins. Every course I send out these, unfortunately, because of COVID, I haven't been able to hand them out in person, but I mail out those pins to my students. And then they can wear the pins and not just be death ambassadors, but have the pin to spark the conversation. So someone says, hey, what's a death ambassador? And then they're hooked into that conversation that they now have to have about death and death education and why death awareness is so important. And so, one of the things that I noticed when I was teaching these courses, I begin by talking about death denial and what death denial is in our society, and the silence around death, the taboos around death, all the things that we're not supposed to be talking about. And what I realized is that the students weren't aware of that term. They weren't aware of the term death denial. But as soon as I described death denial to them, then they understood perfectly. Almost instantly, there was this immediate recognition that death denial is the air that they breathe, and that their relationships and their family dynamics are all governed by that silence around talking about death. And I think what happened is that they found it liberating to have the space to talk about these things. And it has affected their relationships, their connection with their family, their own issues, their own anxiety about death, because, one of the obvious factors of death denial that we see coming out, and I see it especially in my students, is death anxiety. Death anxiety is a product of death denial in our culture. Because there's silence, because my students experience deaths and no one talks about it, because they have questions and no one entertains those questions, they end up internalizing that silence and internalizing that fear and really exacerbating their death anxiety. And so what I witness over the course of a term is a kind of slow dissolution of that anxiety, an ameliorating of that anxiety, a diminishment of it, because they are equipped with the tools and the ability to understand that the more we talk about these things, the more we educate ourselves about these things, the less terrifying it is. And so this has really become, in many ways, I think, my life's work. I think it's part of one of the most important things I've been doing in education. And I feel really strongly as well that the humanities disciplines, because I teach in religions and cultures and I'm coming out of a humanities discipline, the humanities are absolutely essential for thinking about end of life and death awareness. And I think that while we recognize that we need the humanities to live well, we need art and music and poetry and history and philosophy and all of those things, we also need them to die well. And if you will just take a gander at some of the books that have been written by palliative care docs and people working in healthcare and nurses, that what you find is collections of stories. They're all stories. Stories are at the heart of the humanities. They're at the heart of religion. They're at the heart of spirituality. This is how we understand these deep truths and mysteries, and death is one of those mysteries. So I would argue that humanities education is absolutely critical as to be a part of the death awareness movement. And we have a movement on our hands, and the proof is going to be in what you're going to hear today from my students. And so essentially what we're going to do is I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves when I call them up, and they're going to tell you a little bit. I have 2 questions that I'm going to be asking them, and then maybe some wildcard questions after that, maybe some questions from the audience if there are any. But the 2 questions I want to ask them are, why is death education so important at the university level, what we would call post-secondary education? Why does it matter that students are taking death courses? And then the other question I'm going to ask is a more personal question. I'm going to let them delve into their experience. And that's a question about how death education has affected them personally. What are the things that have happened in your life having taken these courses and learned about death awareness and all of the elements of what death education is? So I'm going to start by asking Cass to tell us about her experience. So let's start, Cass, with my question: why is death education so important at the university level?
All right. Well, first of all, hello, everybody. My name is Cassidy Corhonen. I'm an English major. I'm just finishing up. I'm graduating in about 2 weeks in December. So I'll have my BA in English studies, and I've got a minor in history. So that's kind of where I come from in the world of academia. And I'm a death ambassador. And when I die, I want my body to be buried, have a green burial, and maybe potentially recomposed if we get there by that time. If I have enough money by that time. I'm the kid at Christmas that's like, start paying in advance. And my parents were like, what? That's not a cool Christmas gift. Anyway, so I'm going to answer what Susan has just asked us about why this is so important in our field of work and post-secondary setting. And I think the first way that I can enter this this question is that the essence of academia itself, it comes from a place of curiosity. And I think that, well, like Susan said, death is the great mystery of life, right? And so we are able in these unique settings where diverse minds and diverse worldviews kind of come together in this almost, community of like almost a mosaic, a community where we have all these differing experiences coming together to collaborate in a space that is way more conducive to challenging and serious conversations you're not just going to have while you're sitting at the hairdresser per se, where we're in a space where you feel more attentive, you feel as if you're more engaged by the orator, by the lecturer, by your peers, where you feel almost safe to have these conversations. And that's what we've experienced as a class or, throughout the years with Susan's work. But also to be reminded that death is the great equalizer. So even though we all come from different walks of life, we all have different thoughts in our heads, it's the one truth that we all share and that links us in our mortality. It doesn't discriminate. We will all die at some point. So I think that almost becomes a comforting common ground where you're able to sit and be attentive and listen, knowing that you can't challenge that reality. That is the one unchanging truth. And I think as well, it's important with the demographic specifically of the youth, because they are, responsible for the future of more abstract ideas of, say, the climate crisis or the dying planet, dying industries, but then also taking care of our elderly as well, right? We're young people who are able-bodied, who are eventually in the years to come going to have to take care of potentially a parent or a grandparent or a family member as they transition into the later years of their lives. So much like Dr. Strigley says, we come to these spaces and we kind of equip ourselves with the tools that we need and the language that we need to be able to have these conversations and to take them from our little institutions or our big institutions and to disperse them into the world and to kind of create that or cultivate that, that desire to change and what I say, reform the norm, to go out and to network and to enter communities with our little pins and cause the conversation to kind of go from there.
Thank you, Cass. Much appreciated. All right. Who wants to take on this question next? Kaylee, why don't you tell us why death education is so important at university?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaylee. I study fine arts and religion at Nipissing University. I am a death ambassador, and when I die, I would like my body, as Cass said, to be recomposed into potting soil. I love plants, so it would be amazing to repurpose that once my body decomposes. I believe that death education is a crucial subject in university because I view the transition of entering post-secondary as a pivotal moment in people's lives. It's typically a space where you really navigate your own identity and figuring out your interests and what you like to learn about, so finding your own place in the world, but while also finding connections to other people. So kind of like how Cass brought up how university is a place for connections and finding similarities between everyone. I think that death education opens up different conversations and different ideas that discuss things that do connect us, like mortality and death, like physical death. Those are things that definitely bring us together. And since it's a moment where we have to find our own selves, it's also a moment to take a step back and also reflect on how we're all connected.
Absolutely beautiful. Are these not beautiful stories? I love this. Okay, Jade, why don't you tell us why death education is so important at the university level?
Yeah, so I'm Jade. I'm a social work major and death ambassador. And when I die, I want to be buried in a hand-woven wicker casket and hopefully buried in a forest cemetery, though I know we don't have a ton of them around here yet. Hopefully we will in the future. But kind of like drawing on some of the things that Kaylee said, many of us are just entering adulthood, and it is an area where we really start to work in forming our identity and figuring out what we want out of life. And it's a period of intense growth and transformation. So while I can't express enough how important it is to talk to children about death, university is a really great place to broaden our understanding, especially when it's taught by someone as wonderful as Dr. Strigley. She introduces the concepts around death in a way that is comfortable, and it's bound to spark something in everyone, I think, across disciplines. And that's not easy to do when we're talking about something that's perceived to be so delicate and even rejected by many people in our society. And death education is also really, really important in many fields of study, especially the helping professions, I would say, like social work or nursing. And it honestly baffles me that these types of courses aren't mandatory for some of the human service programs where people will actually be encountering death in, on a regular basis at their jobs. But that's not to discredit its importance outside of the human service sector as well, because we're all affected by mortality. So why don't we spend more time learning about it and talking about it? And, I urge you to think about this question. how do you survive grief and grapple with your own mortality when you're missing the knowledge and tools that are necessary to do so? I firmly believe that each and every one of us desperately needs death education, especially when we consider the fact that we're all confined to this sort of modern Western death denying culture. And this has proven true time and time again when I reflect on the experiences of my peers who took Susan's course, and when I talk to people in my life, or even just taking a look at myself. And it's astonishingly clear to me that we're all missing critical pieces of information. And it's information that I believe would make the world an exceptionally different place to live in. And I can assure you that there is nothing negative about death education. And if you're not sold and you think that you don't need it, then chances are you might be one of the people who needs it the most.
So that's amazing. Thank you so much for that. And I think that this is true. And I think you're right to point out that we need death education as, no matter where you are. I mean, we're talking about our experience in the university, but to fill in those missing pieces. And I am working on making these courses mandatory. I don't know. We'll see if the university administration is going to go for it. But enough people are asking that I think it might be part of a university education is to study death. And I think that if anyone's going to change all of this in this world, it's you folks. All right, Jackie, would you like to tell us why you think death education is so important at university, please?
Of course. So greetings. My name's Jackie. I am currently in my 4th year of my undergrad in a Bachelor of Arts in History with a minor in French. And I'm hoping to next year follow through with a master's in history. And when I die, I would like to be buried with a natural burial with a big tombstone. So that's me, a little bit about me. So as to your question, from my perspective as a student and as 21 years old, university sounds and seems like the last youthful thing that I will encounter with my structure in life, right? We go through elementary school, high school, university, and then boom, you're supposed to be in your career. That's my path, at least. And so I think it's very important for those who are in university or in post-secondary to understand death education and the importance of it, because it really reorganizes your priorities. It's empowering. It allows you to figure out, what matters to you, and you can use what matters to you to your advantage in university by choosing what path makes you happy, what path helps you grow, right? Nothing like death education to snap you into understanding that your life can go at any moment. So might as well do things that you love. And at university, you are given all the tools to do this. It is the perfect time. Anytime, you can do this at any time. But in post-secondary, you are choosing your pathways. So do it to something that reflects you. A lot of people, I think, believe there's this notion that death education is all about death. And while it is a big part of it, it teaches us how to live. It teaches us how to live, and it teaches us how to have a good life. And all that, what is a good life is different to everyone. And at university and the post-secondary sector, we are allowed to choose what good life we want. So I think that's amazing. And also, it allows us to think critically about the society we live in Canada, I must say. It's the only society that I'm in. But I'm allowed, as Dr. Strigley was saying in the beginning, I did not know about death denial before my class, but I'm allowed now, I'm given the tools to think critically about every little thing that's death denying, like anti-aging campaigns or just things like that. Death denial. I find it so interesting seeing through, going through my everyday and then thinking about, that's a product of death denial. We got to break that narrative. So I'm so grateful for death education for that. And I think it's an amazing opportunity. And I'm so grateful to be here and to have had death education. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Jackie. Someone has said in the chat that every campus should have death ambassadors. I heartily agree with that. And, you know, as you folks go on, do graduate work, we can continue this movement. If I have 50 students every year coming out of each class times 2, so 100 students a year at Nipissing University going out in the world as death ambassadors, things are going to change. And you guys have great.
Yeah.
What's that?
So we're gonna have a death diaspora out there.
We're going to have a death diaspora. Exactly. Okay. All right. So now we're going to get into the heart of things. Now we're going to hear the stories. And, you know, when this first came about and I was talking to Joe and Victoria, kudos to you for putting on this amazing festival. When I was talking to them about what we would do, and they had reached out to me because of my Death Ambassadors Instagram page, where I highlight some of the teachings, what my students are doing, all things death awareness. And I said, you know, I think really, rather than hearing from me, I think you need to hear from my students. And so that's why I invited a sampling of these incredible students who have taken these death courses and I think really incorporated what they've learned into their lives. And so it seemed an important thing, and I've already talked about the significance of stories, that we get their stories. So that we understand how transformative this is and the kinds of concrete, real events in their lives that have been part of this. And so this is where, you know, they're going to get vulnerable with you, and they're going to tell you some things about their lives that are, you know, deeply emotional and really significant. And so I want to applaud their vulnerability and their willingness and their absolute bravery to share these things with you, because it matters so much. And it's by telling their stories that we can see why this makes such a difference. And just in these 4 lives, how death education and death awareness has transformed them. Listening to each of my students tell me their choice for their bodily disposition after they die is remarkable. I didn't have that. My first experience of death was traumatic because I had no previous conversations about this. I didn't even know what the options were. And I think this is sometimes one of the biggest revelations that my students discover, is that you can be cremated with water. You can, you know, have your body, you know, composted. I mean, it's not legal in Canada yet, but Katrina Spade, get it over here. We got to make this happen. Traditional burials, you don't have to be embalmed. All of these different things that, you know, because we don't talk about it, we don't even know what the options are. And that's been a really empowering part of death education. And how proud am I to hear my students already aware of what they want for their form of death afterwards, right? I think this is probably one of the most significant things, because that's where real change is going to start to happen. So the next question that I'm going to ask is how death education has affected you personally, you know, in relation to your life, your personal life, in relation to your studies, in relation potentially even to your future career. And so Kaylee, I'm going to start with you. Would you like to share with us your story? Thank you.
Hello again. So overall, I think death education has shaped my perspective of living. Like many of us have brought up, you know, understanding death really changes the way we think about living. A little bit about myself. I was, in 2001, I was adopted from China, and I was raised in Southern Ontario in Canada. I was adopted when I was 13 months, so I was a baby. And I don't actually have any knowledge or connection to my birth parents or my family in China. And I've found that death education has actually provided me the tools to help me with that grieving process. It's slightly different, as in these individuals have not necessarily died, but I don't know. It's the unknown that the grieving has been able to help. And a lot of tools that we've talked about in these courses, such as, you know, how to bring up that conversation, how to comfort other people. That's been really helpful, that I can apply to myself, and then my fellow death ambassadors, if I ever have a conversation with them, they can also apply what we've learned. So that's really how it's affected my personal life. And education or career-wise, I am also in Teachers College, so I do plan to become a future educator of the very creative young minds of the world in Ontario, or maybe somewhere else in Canada. I think it's super important that we do bring up death talk with younger generations. Obviously, there might be some sort of filter buffer with age, but again, I still think they should be exposed to life's real topics because, again, that's where the fostering of death now comes from. It comes from the youth. Excuse me. I've also been able to apply it to my current form of study. I'm studying fine arts, and ever since death education, I've been able to make all these connections from death or memento mori images to art, like in art history. There's so many little objects or symbolisms of things that refer to death that now I can understand what they mean, and I can apply meaning to them, and I can connect to them. So that's really made my experience at university so universal. I've been able to connect everything to one another, and that's really grateful, and I'm very happy for that because it's like Jackie mentioned earlier, university is about picking the path and picking what you like. Excuse me. So yes, it's really opened up my perspective of universality and how I can connect my personal experiences to other students' personal experiences. They're different, but they're also the same because they're all under the umbrella of death. Thank you.
Beautiful, Kaylee. Thank you so much. So I also think it's remarkable that we have this cross-section of disciplines from the university. Cass is in English studies, Jade's in social work, Jackie's in history, Kaylee's in fine arts, I'm in religions and cultures. And so we have, we can see the ways in which death education knows no disciplinary boundaries, that it's relevant to any discipline you're in. And I think that what's remarkable as I witness all of you talking, where your particular disciplines feed into the particular ways that you want to think about death education in the future. And so it's shaped directly from your university experience and your university studies. All right, Jackie, why don't you share with us next how death education has personally affected you?
For sure. So I was enrolled in Dr. Strigley's death course in 2020. And at that time, my sister had a near-death experience, a very scary near-death experience. And I was dealing with all these notions of death and all these ideas and fears and anxieties and all the unknowns, like what seemed like alone. And especially in the society that I live in here in Canada, there's not many opportunities to speak about death and to speak about that grieving part in public, in groups. It's hard to find. So when I enrolled in this death course, all of a sudden, I got all these great tools to deal with what I was experiencing. And I think also, as much as death courses refer to, tools and grieving tools to help you grieve death, it also helps you to grieve other parts and to understand other things as well. Near-death experiences is not a death. That person is still alive, but they are heavily affected by it. And even though that has been my closest experience with death, and it's not even death, I'm still given the tools to help. And it's similar with Kaylee, like as she was saying, death has helped her with death education has helped her with the unknown, right? It's not necessarily, it's so diverse how it can help you. And if I didn't have this course, I think my relationship with death could have been very different. And I don't think it could have been as positive because I wouldn't have known the community of support and the rhetoric around death that is so much more accepting and embracing rather than what we typically associate as cold, dark, morbid. So it's really shaped me in the best way possible. And it's allowed me to know and to take pride and to make sure that I think that everything is special. It gives me gratitude and it gives me meaning or mindfulness for both the past, present, and future. And I think that's a great gift. Also, it has shaped me in understanding the logistics of death and opening up that conversation. Yeah, as a 20-year-old or as a 21-year-old, I'm able to talk about what death, how I want to die, what I want at my funeral. And that's not weird. That's not morbid, you know, and that is empowering. So it's shaped my life by allowing me to take hold and take control of the parts of death that I can. I can't control when I die, and I can't control how I die necessarily, but I can control what happens to me after. And I think that's super important. Regarding my discipline in history, I think history shows how meaningful death is. We study death, and that there's stories there, you know, and there's meaning. And one death is meaningful, even though I think oftentimes we get into this idea, this sort of branches off, but with history, it's, the common question I get is, was it useful? How is it useful? You know, how is that going to make you any money? And I get that that's important questions to think about. And I don't think we should push those questions away, but I think it's important to not just boil down something to its usefulness, you know, and I think death education has helped me with that. Like, death education is useful, but it's also showed me to prioritize other things, not just based on their usefulness, but based on how they make me feel, or, you know, how they encourage me to live a happy life. And I think that's important. One thing I want to touch on is in history, we have some experiential learning opportunities where some professors, like one Dr. Earl, she's a professor in history. She, every 2 years before and after COVID, hopefully it hasn't occurred again, but hopefully it will, she takes her students to Poland and Germany on an experiential learning opportunity to learn about the Holocaust. And while there, she cleans off grave sites of, you know, Jewish people. And I think that's important. Why in a history class are we why in a history class are we cleaning off a tombstone? You know, there's meaning, it's important. The stories are important. And I think history really amplifies that, which is very beautiful in my opinion. So. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jackie. And I think that was part of the reason when you said what you want when you die is a big tombstone, right? That's the historian in you speaking out and saying, I want to be remembered. This is going to be part of historical research one day. And I'm going to do my part in preparing that research. I did put in the chat that if people had questions that they could ask them. So I thought just for some fun, we could shake things up. We have lots of time. And so I'm just going to, Carrie Swatsky, hi, nice to see you here, Carrie, asks what some of the topics that we teach in the course. So does someone, I know that's one of sort of our questions at the end, but does someone want to, maybe each of you just say one thing that you learned in one of the two courses. Cass, why don't we start with you? Sorry, just to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you can come up with something.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the one kind of, you know, subunit that we did that stuck with me the most was when we talked about disposition and methods of disposition and the plethora of options that you actually do have. But not only that, Susan really delves into, with the help of Caitlin Doty, but she delves into the practice of the funeral industry themselves and how there's quite a lot of exploitation going on there that is kind of, you know, unfortunately hijacked by the grief that's going on in the state of emotions that the bereaved are in. And so being educated just simply on what you are legally entitled to do with your body, or what you don't have to do with your body, or what your real options are, that you can just be put in a cardboard box and buried naturally. You don't need to have a concrete encasement, or you don't need to be embalmed and put pollutants back into the earth. All of these little things we would never think to question, because I think a lot of the time, unfortunately, the complete lack of conversations beforehand leaves us ill prepared when we arrive there. And so we're most of the time just looking for someone to steer us in the right direction. And unfortunately, that's where the money bags come in. can really, you know, grab your wallet. So, but yeah, so we do go into the more, you know, service industry side of things as well, not just the spiritual and cultural aspects.
Terrific. Thanks, Cass. Did someone else want to offer something that they learned in a class that that was important to them? Free for all? Jade? Okay, Jade, go ahead.
Well, I think the things that stuck out to me the most were actually kind of like the more like religious, spiritual teachings in the course and the readings. I find that they brought me so much comfort, and I guess just provided me with a lot of information that I didn't know that I needed. And, you know, there are readings that I never really would have thought to go out of my way to get on my own. So I'm just really grateful to have been able to learn a lot about how other cultures approach death. And it really helped me to realize that the way we do things here right now is not actually normal for a lot of other places. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of cultures that would probably be pretty appalled by the way that we approach death. And so that just, it made me realize that this doesn't actually have to be the norm, and that this never used to be the norm. And there are better ways to do these things.
Fantastic. Thank you. So there are lots of questions coming up in the chat. So why don't we try a different one? What made you want to sign up for the class? Did the term death put you off, or was that a draw? That's a great question, Jenny. Thank you. Jackie, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I had a near-death experience. Well, my sister had a near-death experience right before I took this class, but I had the course selection way before that happened. Death, actually, I was looking for an elective, you know, and I wanted something interesting to switch it up. So I don't know if everyone, elective is just something, is a course that is outside of my discipline in history, and I was drawn to death. I was like, oh, this is super interesting. When do I ever hear about death? Never, you know, and especially in this light. And so it did draw me in, and I'm very happy it did. But to many others, it drew me off. It drew others off. You know, even telling my mom and my dad and everyone in my family, they're like, what? Like, you want to take a course on death? Especially since the near-death experience, they were not wanting to talk about death at all. They were trying to shut that whole idea out. But I saw the beauty in knowing, you know, ignorance is not bliss when it comes to death. And I think as much as I've gotten more negative feedback from, impressions of the death class rather than positive. But I think that's just because people have such a bad view of death. And when I say, oh, this class on death and dying, they think I'm trying to get to death. They think I'm trying to die. It's no, I just want to live. It helps me live a happy life. So I think I can see how it puts others off, but it drew me in, and I'm very happy it did. So.
Thank you for that. The questions are exploding in the chat, and this is just so encouraging to me because it shows you how much interest there is in this topic. And I noticed that there is a question, and so I think one of the questions, Izumi, that you asked about how friends respond when you broach this topic, this is a question I'll ask again later as well. So we will come to that. But you know, in terms of becoming death ambassadors, this was, you know, something that I said to my students, you can change the conversation, so you will become an ambassador of death. Sounds kind of scary, but it isn't, by going out in the world and having these conversations. And I think that, you know, your other question is, how can we encourage other young folks to take an interest in death? I mean, I don't know, Kaylee, do you want to take a stab at that? Because you are death ambassadors now. You have the pin. You make the conversations happen. And we're going to be hearing still a couple more stories from you about that. But maybe, Kaylee, if you want to say a few things to answer Izumi's question about how we can encourage other young folks to take an interest in death.
Yeah, I definitely think these pins definitely help. It's like the initial first level of starting a conversation. Even it's like the slightest thing. Oh, what is that? But that small things like that, small pivotal moments, that's what directs from going from one direction to the other. I think as university students, since we are offered with a lot of tools to picking, being involved in different communities and events that we enjoy, we can bring our education and our backgrounds and experiences to those separate events. I think it's important that we aren't afraid, we shouldn't be afraid, but we aren't afraid to bring up those conversations or apply our knowledge to things that are already going on. Or we take initiative in creating clubs or creating groups, kind of like how we created this Death Ambassador group, creating social media, just kind of starting and getting the ball rolling. Obviously, we have no control over how involved other people want to be, but if we get the ball rolling and we start those platforms and start all of those discussions, or maybe in classes, if something is relevant to some sort of discussion that we've had, bringing it up, getting the ball rolling again, I think that's the pivotal point, I think, in my opinion, on educating other people, well, especially at the university level.
Yeah. That's a great answer, Kaylee. Thank you so much. There are so many great questions, but I want to make sure that, and I'll come back to them because I see some questions from my colleagues, my English prof colleague who wants to know what are your favorite fictional stories about death. So maybe think on that and we'll come back to that. I also have a question from staff about the gender makeup generally of the class, which is also interesting. You're noticing, of course, that you have 5 folks who identify as women here in front of you. And so I would say, I don't know, you folks have been in the class. I think we are mostly women identified in the class, but I do have fellows as well. Anyone want to, Cass, you want to say something about that?
I would just say, I think you're right. I think that we also go to a university that is skewed in terms of the male-female population, and as well as that a lot of the more caregiver, caretaker roles or professions or disciplines are most often occupied by women, which I think is what has drawn a lot of us in the humanities even. But I know that I walked into that first class hand in hand with my partner at the time, who was a man, and that was quite challenging for us to then be able to leave and pick each other's brains because we couldn't stop thinking about it. And so then we would come back to our friends and, be gabbing away about this and that, and they were like, but then they get interested because, Dev and Cass were radical, but then it was interesting, and then they wanted to hear it, and then they felt like they could talk about it, and then they were excited. And now a lot of my friends are currently in Susan's class, sending me pictures of their pins, and I said, right on. So it spreads. It's whoever you can reach out and touch, it spreads,
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. And I have people now because of the Instagram page, and Kaylee mentioned social media, that has really had a kind of snowballing effect. I have lots of students who are saying, I want to take this course. I want to be a death ambassador. How can I be a death ambassador? Which is just amazing. And anyone can be a death ambassador, right? You don't have to take a course at Nipissing to be that. But anyone who wants to, change the conversation about death. And someone did ask about the pins. Currently, I just buy them and I gift them to my students. But maybe one day we're going to have to start an online shop or something and sell pins because they're pretty popular, I've noticed. But let's get back to your stories, and then I will stay in touch with the questions. But let's hear from our last 2 death ambassadors about their experience. Jade, do you want to go next and tell us your story about how death education has affected you personally?
Yeah. I think in order to really understand the impact that death education has had, it's good for me to start from the beginning. So for as long as I can remember, I've suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder, and this stemmed from my anxiety around death. So it would be, just small things like I would have to put my sock on my left foot before my right foot, or something bad would happen to someone I loved. And I guess that was just my brain's way of trying to cope with something that was totally beyond my control. And I think that if we talk to children more about death, then maybe these types of things could be prevented. And it wasn't until later in life that I really started to realize I'm not alone in this. There are other people who experience this, and I really didn't believe that before. And though I've experienced several deaths throughout my life, it wasn't until last December that I realized the extent to which I was completely unequipped to deal with grief and loss. And that was when my best friend and my biggest supporter, my dog Timo, died. And it was much sooner than I ever anticipated because he had a sudden onset of cancer. And anyone who knows me knows that he was a true beacon of light in my life. And I'm sure many of you can relate to the profound unconditional love that comes with opening your heart to a dog. And he taught me so many lessons. And one that's especially relevant to what we talk about today is the importance of being fully present every single day. And in the short time leading up to his death, I found myself urgently seeking out any sort of information that would help me survive this. I ordered a bunch of books that are now covered in highlighter and bent pages, and I spent hours online doing research about what happens when we die. And then I ended up enrolling in Susan's Death and Immortality course, which conveniently fell right around the same time. And as I kind of mentioned before, the lectures and the readings and discussions just gave me this sense of understanding and community that I desperately needed at the time. And I've never seen people acknowledge death and loss in this way before. And I really don't know what I would have done without it, which is why I find it so disturbing that people don't know what I know now. And really, I'm only just at the beginning of all of this. And so the death course really helps me to unravel a lot of the harmful beliefs that our culture works so hard to weave into us. And I learned that many other cultures are appalled, like I said before, as the way we as a society approach death, and that it never used to be this way and it doesn't have to be. And I was also hit with the stark realization that I was not wrong for feeling the way that I did when Timo died, because, you know, I was fortunate enough to be present with him until the end, like I had always promised. But what I think traumatized me the most during that process, like of his death, was how quickly he was whisked away. I had a few short moments to be with his body, and I had, you know, just this full belief that he was still present in that room with me, even though he had died. And then he was taken to be loaded onto a truck and sent to a different city all alone to be cremated. And I think I knew in my core that something about this was just not sitting right with me, and I couldn't figure out why until I learned in Susan's course how healthy and how normal it actually is to remain present with the dead for much longer than, you know, just those short few minutes, and to, I guess, take the time to care for them and communicate with them and help them ease into the transition beyond this plane of life. And now I know what a good death is supposed to look like, at least for me. And I know that we can be much more involved in these processes than our society has led us to believe. And I know that death is not morbid, which is something that I talk about a lot. But I mean, don't get me wrong, death education and the death positive movement are not intended to be a cure-all. It's not about forcing positive feelings towards something that is devastating. Instead, it's about helping people to see death in a healthier way, which I promise is possible. And, you know, it doesn't take away any of the pain to learn about these things, but it can definitely lessen the horror and lessen the trauma that comes with death. And I find that integrating death awareness into my life has really helped me to live more mindfully and to be more present. And it's helped me to understand the importance of being authentic, you know, being true to myself, even when it's not always easy to do that in the world that we live in. And it's helped me to, I guess, befriend and nurture my grief more, because I figured, you know, why not? It's not going anywhere, and nor would I want it to, because it's really my connection to the people and, you know, the ones that I've lost. And it's a profound act of love. And so I find that, you know, this whole thing has really just changed me as a person. And I'm so grateful for Susan for setting me on this path. And that's why I want to do the same for other people, and why I created Death with Jade, which is my Instagram platform that I use to kind of spark up some of these conversations. And I urge everyone to remember, you know, that we're all spiritual beings, and this means something different for everyone. But you can't have spirituality without the existence of death, because it's really, you know, the key to that side of things. And, you know, I would say in terms of my future studies and my career in social work, I want to highlight the concept of empowerment, because the profession of social work involves kind of a balancing act between service users and the structures that impact them. And it's about empowering individuals and communities to improve their lives and, within these circumstances that are constricting them. And they do this by providing knowledge, tools, and resources that best fit their situation. And so death education really has the same premise. It empowers people to be able to confront death, which we all have to do at one point or another. And it breaks the silence. It stops us from continuing to sweep these things under the rugs. And social workers are also very much needed in the industry, which is something that I do intend to explore, maybe hospice social work, but it's something that I'd want to ease into, maybe start with some, hospice volunteering, something along those lines. And, it's also especially important to consider that not everyone has equitable access to a good death, and they don't all have access to being able to make sure that their needs and their wishes are met. So social work kind of comes into play when it comes to that too. And really just this whole process of exploring death education has been really healing for me, because while my grief is still just as heart-wrenching as it will always be, I don't feel quite as much horror. I'm able to channel my grief into my work, and being a death ambassador feels like a really significant way of being able to honor the ones that I love who have died. And it's really just become an integral part of who I am now. And, none of it is easy. I'm not in any way trying to hide that, but the idea of facing our fears, I think, translates so well with fear of death. And I'm also not trying to pretend that I have any of this figured out. I think I'm just trying to pick up the broken pieces and inspire other people to join me in this process. And I've chosen to be vulnerable with my experiences, not because it's comfortable, but because I want to tell people the things that I once needed to hear. And I guess I just think this world could use a little more raw honesty.
Thank you, Jade. That's beautiful. And I noticed that Steph from Dead Pet Girls on Instagram is here, who appreciated Jade's shout out. Pet loss is real loss, pet bereavement awareness. Thank you very much. And, one of the interesting things that I've noticed is, in fact, that the majority of my students, when they're coming in at 18, 19, 20 years old, that sometimes the only death they've experienced at that point in their life is the loss of a pet. And those are profound experiences because it's their introduction to death. And so I really believe that talking about pet loss is an integral part of death education and being aware of that. So I'm grateful to the Dead Pet Girls on Instagram for all that they do to bring awareness to that as well. And it's interesting, as you were talking and as I'm thinking about these things, when I first started teaching the death and dying classes, I remember thinking, I'm never going to be able to teach death awareness to 21-year-olds. They're immortal. They don't want to think about death. They're just full of life, and so they should be. Why bring them down by talking about death? And what I've experienced is, in fact, the opposite, right? What I've experienced is that, in fact, this is absolutely liberating for my students. And while they're talking about me as the teacher, and while I am ostensibly the teacher of these courses, death is their teacher. And I think, and I hope that what you can see and what everyone is saying is that they are being taught by death. And the greatest teachers in death education are telling us that death is a teacher, right? Starting back, Tolstoy always talks about how death can be our teacher, can be our educator, and we can learn from it. But if we never talk about it and we never think about it or face it, then we don't get that vital education that comes with learning about and thinking about death. All right, Cassidy, we have one student left to tell their story. Cassidy, would you tell us how death education has impacted you personally?
There we go. I lost my internet for a sec, but we came back just in time. Okay. I want to also preface this by thanking all of these ladies for being as vulnerable as they've been today, because, again, like Jade said, it allows and inspires us to also be vulnerable and to then face our own fears. And so I definitely can answer a few questions in the chat with my story. So we'll hit two birds with one stone. But I wanted to answer Jenny, and she asked, was it the term death that drew you to the class? And for me, it actually was. And so I would say my introduction to death denial, especially into the trauma of deaths that go unspoken, is when I was 15, I lost my friend and my classmate to suicide. And obviously it was a pretty traumatic experience for myself and his basketball teammates and the school. And so it unfolded in the ways that it does on television, very sterile, you know, the circle of chairs in the gymnasium, an expectation that you were allowed out of class for maybe 20 minutes to go talk to the counselor and you were back. And it was wrapped up neatly and tucked away and never talked about by the older people in the room. Younger people in the room wanted to talk about it. They just didn't know how, and they didn't know if they were allowed to. It felt like it might, you know, cause some spooky spell to go off if we said Mason's name, right? And so what happens, and because I'm an English major, because I'm, you know, I'm a writer, I'm a poet, and so I'm so invested in narrative and storytelling. And so not only did we lose our friend, but we lost our ability to carry him with us through an oral history, through a memorial of just telling stories, because we were so anxious to even speak about him, like the Grim Reaper would show up, right? That it also erased all of the potential to at least memorialize him in his afterlife and to carry him with us later on. And so fast forward through, you know, my teenage life, I myself, you know, kind of had a bit of a rough and tumble with my own mental health, and especially this month talking about men's mental health. It's so important that we break through and we have these conversations, because once they are silenced, it becomes extremely hard to speak up again. And so I came to death and dying always thinking of death as an escape, as an outcome, as a release from pain, and not necessarily as the most transformative and beautiful moment in time that it could be. And that's what Susan really taught me. And so from there, I really began to reflect on, like Jackie has said so many times, the value of the present and the value of my own life, and what was a good death for me, and what was a good death for my mom and my Nana and the other people in my life that I cared so deeply about. And so I became so passionate about not only reclaiming my own life and empowering my own life through allowing myself to have a peaceful death and not a violent death, but also to repair those generational gaps in the stories where my mom had lost her own father when she was 13, a grandfather that I never knew, but didn't feel like she could ever talk about because it would maybe upset people, make them uncomfortable. You know, you don't want to make them feel uncomfortable for your grief. It's their burden, right? So I come to her now at 22 and I'm able to say, tell me about Grandpa Stu, tell me a story about him. And she lights right up, because you can see that relief of maybe 20 years of wanting me to understand who this man was and not knowing if, you know, if I could handle it, because society had told her, don't tell children. Well, Sarah Winters will agree with me. Neil Gaiman will tell you, don't lie to children. Don't lie to them. Tell them the truth. They can handle it. And so my younger cousin, he's got an imagination that is out of this world. And every time I hang out with him, he's 10, he tells me these theories that I have no reason to doubt. And you know what? He's created his own reincarnation theories with dragons and whatnot. And I think it's fascinating. It really, truly is. And it's inspiring to be able to just be so open, and it brings you closer to these people. And so my Nana, she lives in North Bay. I'm the last of the family around, and I'm able to go and sit with her and, you know, work through things through humor as well, right? It doesn't always have to be, you know, so grim. And to say, you know, what do you want me to do when you're gone? Like, should I give you a bath? What would you like? Like, you know what I mean? And she's like, I've never thought of this, you know what I mean? So it opens those conversations. And then I also developed the interest in volunteering with the Nipissing Serenity Hospice, which is very, very new to our community. And so volunteering there, I began just in the kitchen, getting my feet wet, just being in the space, and contributing in any way that I can. And so this week I'm finally able to go in and do my first visiting volunteer shift. I don't like to call it a shift, but I'm able to go in and visit and to sit with the residents. And I think that that not only offers something profound in terms of offering compassion and companionship, but also for, on my end, the receiving end of it, where you're able to learn a lot. There's a lot of wisdom that sits in those moments in time. And so I will be bringing in stories. I will be sitting and I will read to them if they are so inclined, if they're willing to listen to me read. And so I had answered Professor Winters about fiction, and Alistair MacLeod, a Canadian writer now passed, but he writes incredibly emotive short stories and short story cycles. And The Road to Rankin's Point is a story that I just came across in my seminar class, and quite profound in terms of its transcendence from one state of existence at least to another. And so that's a story that now I take from an English class that is unrelated to death, and I bring it with me when I go into the hospice, and I sit and I share and I offer art for spiritual healing. So that's where I wound up. But eventually I'm going to be doing my master's in September. And much like Jade, I have a passion for social justice. So I find myself trying to create some kind of mega interdisciplinary master's degree that I can create or do, or a project where I can involve all of these conversations, narrative, memory, end-of-life care for the marginalized populations, and palliative pet care is what Susan Strigley will be eventually bringing into this world.
Yes, my dream, which is slowly, emerging into the world, is to open up my own pet hospice. And so, who knows? It could come about one of these days. All right, let's take a look at the questions here before we continue. Okay. Oh, well, someone asked a question. Catherine McRobbie, I don't know if you're still here. Do you each have firsthand experience of working with deceased people? I'm going to guess no, but does anyone have any experience? Jackie?
I don't have any professional experience. That sounds terrible. But I just mean, a few years ago in 2019, my grandpa died, and he did so in a way that he was on life support and we took him off life support. And it was, I guess that was my first experience with guiding, and my only experience with guiding someone into death, I guess. And it was very beautiful, and it was so healing. We had all the family, so all of my grandpa's children, my aunts and uncles, all the cousins, and we were just there, and we sort of comforted him until his death. And I thought, how could you not do this? How could you not be there with someone for their passing hours, passing minutes? And then the doctors came in once we were leaving, and they were like, can we interview you for a movie? Or I don't know what the movie was, and I don't know, but they were like, this was beautiful. We never see this. And we, most of the time, people just die alone when they are taken off life support sometimes, or it's just the nurses or the doctors here. And that just blew my mind. And so I guess I never worked with deceased people, or with the deceased, but I guess if that's sort of what you're looking for potentially, I was very grateful to have experienced my grandpa's death in that way. And so, yeah, and it would be something that I'd be open to, I want to share to everyone, to be able, if they have that experience, or if they have that opportunity to do that, because it was very beautiful. So that was my experience with working with deceased people.
Thank you, Jackie. And I think that that's a really important point. So as I said, the majority of my students, Cass narrated the story of a fellow student who had committed suicide in high school. And so, so those kinds of experience come into my class through my students, but the majority, it's either a pet or it's maybe a grandparent. And so, really you're just coming into your experiences of death and death, awareness and sort of thinking about these things. It's lucky that you got to do that, Jackie, with your grandfather. But I should say that I'm not just a professor of religions and cultures and teaching death education. I came to this and part of the reason that I decided it was important to teach these courses on death ed and to develop new courses is because when I had my death trauma, which was the loss of my father 21 years ago, that was an experience that made me realize that I was not equipped for this, and that I was really traumatized by the experience. And so I think that part of the reason this teaching is so important to me is that I want to try and make sure that my students don't experience that trauma when they have those kinds of death experiences. And I feel like death education would have changed things for me. I think that I was a product of death denial, and that's why my experience was so traumatic. And so my reaction to that inevitably was to go and train to be a palliative care volunteer. And so I have been doing palliative care visitations. We're part of a traveling hospice, and I've been doing that for the past 20 years. So I've spent a lot of time vigiling and sitting with clients as they're dying and giving respite to their families. And so really these courses have become a kind of amalgamation of both my life doing hospice and palliative care work, and sort of bringing that into the classroom and introducing that to students. And so I've also just recently completed my training as a death doula. And so I feel like because I teach death doulas and I teach, sort of the new ways in which death care is being reclaimed, and the work that our ancestors have always done, taking care of the dead, is coming back through the practice of and the work of death doulas. So in that sense, the course is not purely academic. The course is both academic, but also has these practical elements that I like to bring into it so that students have an encounter with that. In 1 year of the course, I had 4 students do a placement with Near North Palliative Care, our traveling hospice association. So they got to do that. And then also I am now doing, I'm trying to do monthly education workshops at our local hospice, which Cass has already mentioned, Nipissing Serenity Hospice, as a way to bring that education into the community and to share it. When I mentor new volunteers with Near North Palliative Care, I see them bringing their death stories into the conversation. That's why they're here, and they want to show up and do the work. And so it's part of both an academic and a community venture, death education and death awareness. And I know there's been lots of interest just in the local news here with the fact that all of you are part of this festival and telling your stories about why death education matters. So that's been amazing. Okay, so I've got some wild card questions that I'm going to ask our students. And I think some of these might have been answered. So if you feel like you don't have anything else to say, we can adapt. But I guess maybe I would like to ask Jackie first. What are some, you did mention a few of these, but what are the kinds of things that your friends and family have said to you when you're taking a course on death? What kind of reactions have you gotten from your peers or your family or strangers you tell in the street?
Yeah, and I'll also sort of answer a question in the chat as well, like how do you start the conversation with your peers in that way? I'm a very out there person, I find, so I'm very open with talking, especially about any topic. I like to talk about deep and profound ideas. So to me, I know this is not the experience for everyone, but to me, it's super easy to just bring up the death course right away, or things like that. So I find I typically start the conversation about death with my family and my peers, and it is difficult. I find more often than not, my family and peers are not open to the conversation because to them it's too painful. And that is what I think it's important as for death ambassadors, is to know that we're not pushing death education on people who are not open to hear it. And you need to really, and this is a lesson I learned from Dr. Srigley, and I learned it in my real everyday life because I experienced it. I'm super happy, or not happy, I'm super excited to talk about some topics. Oh my gosh, have you heard of this new way you can be treated when you die? And my family is like, Jackie, no, I cannot take that right now. And, and I say, okay, we're not going to talk about it. I'm not going to push, because death is a difficult topic to some people. And as much as it's important, you can't force something on someone who's not ready to hear it. So I think it's important just letting people know, like, I'm a death ambassador. Well, you don't even need to say that, but you can, if you ever want to talk about it, and when they're ready, they come and talk to you. Like, I've had that experience with my dad, actually. He knew I was in the death course, and his dad passed away when he was young, and he's opened up to me incredibly, very little morsels of information, and I'm like, wow, like, this is so beautiful. And it's not because I said, I'm a death ambassador, talk to me about your grief. We're building connections that evolve over time, and people, as soon as they realize, like, wow, there are outlets, there are people who can talk, there is ways to deal with grief happily, or not happily, healthier than just shutting it down, that he has been for the past 30 years, right? So yeah, kind of circling it back into the question, the responses have been not always so open, and yeah, it's okay. Just letting them know that you're there if they're ever willing. And if they are willing, just go to town and have fun. And people often think that talking about death, especially my family, they'll say, doesn't that like bring you down? Doesn't that have like poor negative implications on your mental health? And I say, yes, it does have implications on my mental health. It ameliorates it. It makes it better. Like, I'm healthier, I'm happier, I'm not stressed about death. Death is like can be such a scary thing, but with death education, it's eased a lot of my stresses and worries. And I think people are starting to hear it, and it's a slow process, and everyone needs to be patient as a death ambassador. And people will start to come to you when you put it out there, and I think that's a very beautiful thing that I've experienced, and I hope everyone gets to experience that at some time. So
Jackie, that's just pure magic. That's pure magic, that story. And really, I think that part of what we do, I'm wearing a Future Corpse shirt. Am I going to walk in to sit with my palliative client and wear that shirt? No, I'm not going to wear that there. But I'm going to wear it as an educator. I'm going to wear it at a death conference or a death festival, because we know that this is the conversation people are having. But what it means, and I think what Jackie was also recognizing, is that discernment is required to have these conversations. And this is where the pins are helpful, because then people can come to you and say, what is a death ambassador? And so, part of what students are learning in these courses is the subtle appreciation for when's the right time and place. I have learned the hard way not to start talking about death education at dinner parties, right? Some dinner parties, it's A-okay. Other dinner parties, I have shut down conversations and made everyone feel awkward. Do I also irritate my family having these questions? Why does your sister always talk about death when we're together, right? These kinds of things happen on a regular basis. And so, it's learning to recognize and distinguish and discern when the moment is to do that. It looks like we might have lost Cass, so hopefully she will pop back in a second. But let's go to our next question, which is for Kaylee. How do you describe the death course to other students? And I know you've spoken to it a little bit, but see if you want to say a few more things about it.
Yeah, kind of to go off of what we were just talking about with approaching it with peers. This is kind of like the same kind of mindset that I kind of have. Again, not pushing anything, but when I get asked questions, like, what is this about? Like, what are you learning about? I have an educational background in religion and culture, so I often kind of start, I guess you could say, soften the blow, kind of with like, do you know how in different cultural settings, how there's different rituals regarding death, and how different people from different places, they manage death differently. There's different forms of ceremonies and et cetera, et cetera. I kind of start with that because that's an easier, I guess you could say, for someone who isn't as open to death. It's an easier way to comprehend, I can see that. I can see that how that's something that happens in various different cultures, and some of them being religious practices, but that happens in very different cultures. So I can understand how that's something that's also an over like a blanket theme in everyone's life. So I kind of start with that kind of discussion. And then that's when I bring in more of like the mortality aspect of it, and now how we can actually as humans connect to the physical death part. So yeah, I usually start off with a lighter note of my religion and culture, and then I kind of incorporate it into like our everyday life.
That's the way to do it, Kaylee. Religion in through the back door, as your religion professor says. Let's get talking about death, and we'll use religion as well to make that conversation happen. So, Cass, I was going to ask you, what were some of the most exciting ideas that you learned? And I know you've spoken to a few of them. I don't know if you want to add on that or yeah.
No, for sure. Sorry about my little internet boot.
That's okay. I'm glad you're back.
Everyone was talking like a robot for a while there. No, and that's actually a perfect question, because I'm trying to remember. Oh, Azumi had asked, how do you start the conversation with your peers? And so I'll share a quick anecdote about my quite actually immediate reaction to one of Susan's classes, which was she had us do an exercise, which was almost like an introduction to both ourselves, our classmates, and to our professor, that I would recommend you do if you're in a relationship with somebody, or you're close with a friend, or you're whoever. It's an interesting exercise where she asks you to write down the answer to a question. So she'll prompt you and she'll say, what death do you fear the most? And so you'll take a minute and you'll reflect. It's nothing that we usually think about, but we have an answer. We do, because it comes right to your brain. And I'll tell you that most common was drowning, or burning, or a car accident of some kind, something violent, something that would be painful.
Or dying in a plane crash.
Dying in a plane crash was you, yes, you and your friend who happened to be on the plane.
Yeah.
Yes. That's a story for another time, but yeah. And so then she lets you kind of ease up, and she says, well, what is a good death for you? And that's more of an open-ended, abstract question, because I found most people go right to with the bad death, the cause of death, or what it feels like. But when you ask somebody what's a good death, for me, I could say good death is, being read to, or listening to music, or being in the woods. But somebody else could say it's with people, it's this, or I get to eat this, or I get to have these textures. Very different answers. So it teaches you a lot about people. And so this inspired me to run home and come up the stairs and say to all my housemates, we're going to have a death cafe. And they were like, what the heck are you on to now, casting all her radical ideas? And so I said, but it'll be fun, guys. It'll be fun. I'll make it fun. We'll have wine. We'll have snacks. And they were like, okay, maybe. And so when you make it special in that way, there is something kind of cool about the Death Ambassador label, I think. People are intrigued by it. They want to know what it is. There's, people are quick to say that's morbid, but there's also some mystery to the morbid, right? And so I think once you open that conversation by saying, let's do an activity together where I'm going to engage and you're going to engage, and it's going to be great if we commit, If you hold back, it's like anything. If you hold back, you're going to fumble it. But if you can commit and you can find those vulnerable spaces to share maybe your fears or, the things that you look forward to. And that's what I learned was, well, what can I do to make the end of my life when I'm 123? I don't know. But, what's that look like for me? And what does that look like for all of these women in the room? And so now I tend to pester people with that. What do you want done with your body when you die? Read the room, of course, not after a really bad day, but it seems to be it's not your, traditional conversation starter on a date. So I don't know, maybe next time you're on a date or something, you'll just slide that into the conversation, but it's fresh, it's new, and it gets us talking. So do the exercises, I guess I could say.
Thank you, Cass. That's great. A great reminder of that class. I remember that now. And in fact, that exercise comes from Joan Halifax's book, Being with Dying. And I've found that has been a really helpful exercise to get students thinking about their own mortality. One of the other things that we do is their first assignment is usually a death reflection, which means paying attention to, what are your experiences of death? What have they been like? How have they affected you? What is your relationship to death now? And what would you like to change or improve? So I think those kinds of questions are really important, and they immediately, I think that what happens in these death courses is that I start by letting my students know or reminding them that they're going to die, which is not maybe the cheeriest news to begin a course with, but that's the beginning premise, is that we have to get comfortable with our own mortality before we can start having these conversations. That is the elephant in the room. That is the thing that no one's talking about. And so the fact that each of them started today by telling you their preferred method of disposition after death is, I think, a real acknowledgement of the work that they've done to think about their own deaths and to recognize that. And then to have the conversations with their family members, with their friends, with their parents, is the way that this keeps moving. So last wildcard question for Jade. Jade, what does being a death ambassador mean for you? And I know in some ways all of you have just beautifully represented what being death ambassadors are, but Jade, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you think it means?
Well, I think the thing that you mainly emphasized about, your courses and about death ambassadors is that it's about changing our conversations on death, and it's about spreading knowledge and breaking down some of these barriers. And for me, it's formed kind of a set of values that I apply to my life now, my everyday life. And it's a commitment to helping others and being willing to have some of those harder conversations, or just being present in some of life's most difficult moments, things that a lot of people don't want to face. And I think, I plan on carrying this kind of legacy forward as much as I can and spreading it as much as I can. I talk about it to a lot of people. I talk about it to coworkers. I bring it up in situations where, it's going to throw people off guard, but it works. And I've seen it. I've seen people that I know who are spreading some of this information to their partners and their families and their friends. And you wouldn't believe how fast it actually catches on. And it's because it's one of these things, right? It's taboo, and it's something that affects every single one of us. So I think we need to be talking about it. I mean, the only way that I think I can cope with anything that's difficult in my life is to talk about it, and to feel like there are other people who are also willing to talk about it and who can relate to these things. And, one way that I've planned on kind of carrying this too is, like I mentioned earlier, my Instagram account, because it's where I'm able to not only spread a lot of that information, but it holds me more accountable and committed to this type of work that is really important to me.
Thank you, Jade. I was actually just putting in your Instagram handle into the chat. So Death with Jade. I don't know if there are periods in between, but nope, there we go. So there's Jade's Instagram account. You can have a look. Like I said, this teaching has been revelatory for me because I've seen how transformative it has been. And, we did have a conversation, and Cassidy mentioned this as well about, don't lie to children, especially about death. And I noticed when I was marking my students' assignments after teaching a segment of the course on children, death, and dying, that which and the bottom line of that conversation was, don't lie to kids, because they know and they figure it out, and they're way smarter than we give them credit for about things like death, and they're intuitive. And what I realized in marking my students' assignments after that class was that my students are the product of lying to kids about death. My students have experienced the raw deal that is silence about death, and it has damaging implications. It has created anxiety, it has created OCD, it has created grief, it has created fear, it has created a sense of being alone. All of the things that you've heard today have come out of our death-denying society, and kids have borne the brunt of that, because we not only do not talk about death in society, but we especially don't talk about it with children. Children have always been bedside, like we've said, only about 100 years ago, as Caitlin Doty reminds us, have we been outsourcing our whole funeral industry and spending time with the dying and being present to the dying. And kids were always a part of that. And so my students are the product of that death denial, of that, sort of shielding kids from death and dying. But what have we learned about kids and death? That we think talking about death increases their anxiety. The fact is, not talking about death increases their anxiety. And so what you have all just witnessed here is the stories of students who have had the opportunity to break out of these damaging narratives and silence around death, And this has affected their lives, and it's going to continue to affect the lives of all of the death ambassadors that they join with, their families, their peers, and it's going to continue. So I don't think I have, Fran Cucci is here, lovely, one of our board members at Nipissing University. Well done, everyone. Truly a course for all students, everyone. It's all about life. It's absolutely about life, Fran. Thank you so much. Martina, we are creating love. Yes, we are creating love. This is really amazing. Izumi, how can we lobby having this movement in local academia as an outsider? I think that we need to do this. Martina asks, is there a way to connect virtually with all of your death ambassadors? Well, certainly one way you can connect is through my Death Ambassadors Instagram page. And Jade has her own, which I've also shared. So you can reach out to me and I can definitely put you in touch with them. And I'm going to be talking to CTV News after this, our local news station, about this festival and about everything that we've been doing. And so this is, I think that the movement is happening. It's certainly happening here in North Bay, Ontario, Canada. If no one has any other further questions, I think we'll just wrap it up there. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Kaylee and Jackie and Jade and Cass. You have been such a pleasure to teach, but even more so a pleasure to work with you on this. I'll just say, leading up to this process, we've had many conversations and text chats and dress rehearsals and conversations about this. And I think we've all learned from one another and really sort of deepened our connection. And, when I die, I don't have children, so I'm counting on you guys to be with me bedside, okay? There's a very specific motive here. You got to show up for me, okay? That's the deal. All right, it's been absolutely lovely. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks to the Death Ambassadors for bringing the movement.
And thank you, Dr. Srigley, for organizing all of this and bringing this to us. We would not have this opportunity or this education without you, and it's just so life-changing. You are changing lives, and thank you so much. Really incredible. Thank you.
Thank you all. Okay, much love to everyone. Bye.